so the last section of this unit is going to be the presidencies of Carter and Reagan. So Jimmy Carter here to the left and Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter is a Democrat, Ronald Reagan is a Republican, and we are going to discuss their presidencies. So, like we said, the 1976 presidential election. This is again a recap. This is what we left off on the last section. Gerald Ford, who was the vice president under Richard Nixon. Remember we said that he becomes president after Nixon resigns. Ford did not have a very successful presidency. He had a lot of economic problems. He also had pardoned Richard Nixon, which had angered a lot of Americans. So in the 1976 election, the two top candidates were Jimmy Carter and Ford. Jimmy Carter is a Democrat, and Ford, remember, is Republican from Nixon. So Jimmy Carter wins the 1976 election. Now, President Carter. He wants to be relatable to Americans. And so one of the things that he does is he starts to bring back something that we know from Franklin Roosevelt, fireside chats. He also does not cater to Congress, and he refused to play an insider game. He believed that both Democrats and Republicans voted to not pass his budget proposals, tax reforms, and welfare programs. So they actually both turned on him. This is Carter at the desk in the Oval Office. He is addressing the American public in 1977. Now, what you need to know. The president has to kind of play or compromise with Congress slightly in order to pass laws. That's how this works. So if you can't play the game, or if you cannot learn to compromise, then you will not have a very successful presidency. And this is what happens to Carter. The American economy. Carter believed that the energy crisis was the country's largest issue. If you remember, during the last section of notes, we talked about stagflation and we talked about OPEC. He did not want the U.S. to rely so heavily on imported oil from OPEC. He also starts to urge Americans to use less oil and gas. And in November of 1978, the National Energy Act was passed. So what this does, it places a tax on automobiles that were not fuel efficient. It also removes the price controls on oil and natural gas produced in the United States. Okay, so the effort here, the reason they removed the price controls is because they were trying to encourage more oil production in the U.S. and less reliance on OPEC. It also extended tax credits for the development of alternative energy. This is Carter signing the National Energy Act. Now, again with inflation. And think about, remember we talked about the economy. In the summer of 1979, OPEC created an oil shortage in the United States, and it increases prices. So again, we have an oil shortage. Remember, people are very reliant on gasoline, and as another effect, they increase their prices. Inflation in the United States rose from 7.6% to over 11%. By 1980, inflation was 14%, the highest rate since 1947. What you also need to know is that the United States standard of living dropped from first in the world to fifth, and the unemployment rate was 8%. This is a horrible, horrible economy. Okay, I'm also going to show you this again. We did discuss this in, I think it was our Great Depression, World War II unit notes, something like that. But what you need to know, like I said, with the standard of living, this is something that we'll talk about in economics. The standard of living is the level of comfort, material goods, and necessities available to a person or group. For the purposes of economics, politics, and policy, It's usually compared across time or between groups defined by social, economic, or geographical parameters. Now, what I'll show you is we will have standard of living, United States 2020. They probably won't have 2020 up here yet, but I think it's around 35, no, maybe 32,000 cost of living. Okay. So why is my, we'll do this. Okay, here we go. All right, so this will show. All right, so this says America's standards of living are at an all-time high. That's not what I was trying to show you. I was trying to show you the standard of living, the amount of money that you'll have to make in order to not be considered poverty. Okay, we'll pause on this and I'll do that next. So, what you also need to know is that Carter's popularity, of course, heavily dropped during this point, and it would lead to his defeat in the 1980 presidential election to Ronald Reagan. So Jimmy Carter actually only served one term in office. So some other things that Jimmy Carter did. He did address civil rights and human rights, but many felt he didn't do enough. This picture here is Andrew Jackson being sworn in as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in 1977. He appointed Andrew Young as the first African American to be a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He also appointed 28 African Americans, 14 Latinos, and 29 women to the judicial branch, which, if you remember, we have under the judicial branch the Supreme Court, federal courts, and district courts. Okay, so international policies. I know this is a lot. So Carter would follow realpolitik, which is the policy of negotiating with powerful countries despite their actions. He wanted a foreign policy that was committed to human rights. He believed the United States needed to promote human rights and freedoms around the world. Carter took actions against countries that had a friendly relationship with the U.S., but did not treat their citizens humanely. Now, this almost sounds a little bit like imperialism in a way, because you've seen as we've gone over these notes and over these different units that the United States kind of have a tendency to police other countries in a way. Carter took actions, like I said, against other countries that had friendly relationships with the U.S. but did not treat their citizens humanely. He also cut off military aid to Argentina and Brazil because their governments had imprisoned and tortured their own citizens. The Bureau of Human Rights in the State Department was established, and some felt Carter was not consistent. He refused to support Nicaragua, a non-communist country led by a dictator, but he supported a dictator-led South Korea and the Philippines. So it's like, what do you want? Are you going to support communism, or are you going to support non-communism? How do you justify your actions? In 1977, Carter signs treaties with Panama. If you remember, we talked about Panama when we went over Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt with the Panama Canal. In December 31st of 1999, Panama would be given full control of the Panama Canal. The United States had control of this area since 1914 under Teddy Roosevelt. So if you look here, this is a picture. President Carter and the Panamanian leader Omar Torres signing the Panama Treaty in 1978. Now, Soviet relations. The detente ended. Carter did not approve how the Soviet government treated its citizens who opposed its policies. On June 18th, 1979, SALT II was finally signed. This was an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. It did not reduce each other's countries' weapons, but it did place limits on the number each would produce or could produce. Keep in mind, we are still going through the Cold War. It has not officially ended yet. Most of the Senate did not want to ratify this treaty. Now, here's what you need to know also. This is another government thing. The president has the power to sign treaties with other countries, but it must be ratified by the Senate to be official. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, Carter no longer supported the SALT II agreement. Tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States increased, and the United States actually boycotted the 1980 Olympics that were held in Moscow, which is Russia. Well, it's Russia today. It was the Soviet Union at that point. All right, we also have what are known as the Camp David Accords. In 1948, there was a conflict between Israel and the surrounding Arab countries, or this is when it began. Carter helped Israel and Egypt find peace in 1978. Carter also invites Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin to Camp David. Camp David is kind of like an area where it's like a retreat where the president will sometimes go to get out of the public eye or to kind of relax. They play golf, So on September 17th, we have what are known as the Camp David Accords, which are signed. Israel's first peace treaty with an Arab country since 1948. Israel also agrees to withdraw its troops from the Sinai Peninsula. And I'll show you that on a map real quick. All right, so let me show you. This is Egypt. This is the Sinai Peninsula. And then you have Israel right here. All right, with Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Here's another picture of that closer. So, and this is over in the Middle East. So back to the notes. And we'll go down. So, at this point, Egypt also agreed to recognize Israel's right to exist. If you remember, post-World War II, we said that Israel was a country that was created for the Jews to have a place to go. That means that they had to take land from other countries to give to the Jews. Because of this, Egypt and Palestine had been angered. Palestine actually lost land, and they have had this conflict between them, and it still exists today. So this is the picture of these three at the Camp David Accords in 1978. Now, another thing that we have, the Iranian Revolution. This was a very rough time over in Iran. A lot of people fled to the United States during this time. In January of 1979, a revolution began in Iran, which means there is going to be some sort of overthrow of the previous government, and it will transition into something like maybe a dictatorship or an unstable government. So the revolution began, and Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi fled to Egypt. In February, the former Iranian leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, I'm sorry guys if I'm butchering this, returned to his position after living in exile for 14 years. Khomeini established law based on the Quran, which is part of Islam. In October, the United States gave the Shah permission to enter the country to receive cancer treatment. In November, the armed Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and 66 people were taken hostage. 53 of those were Americans. So this leads into what is known as the Iranian hostage crisis. The students who were supported by Khomeini demanded the U.S. send the Shah to Iran in exchange for the hostages. So now there again, this revolution that is happening, one leader has now fled, the other leader has come into power, and now they want the old leader to probably end up killing him, to be honest. But remember, the old leader is in the United States receiving treatment, and they have now, what am I trying to say? Sorry, I have a brain freeze here. They have now stormed this military, it's not military base, they have stormed this, embassy. Wow. It's late, guys. I'm sorry. They have stormed this embassy. They have taken people hostage, and now they're trying to make demands. So President Carter refuses, and the negotiations last over a year. So they actually have these hostages for over a year. The U.S. then decides to place sanctions on Iran and cut diplomatic ties. Sanctions are taxes or extra taxes on these countries. So if Iran ever wanted to try to trade with the United States, they would place taxes or restrictions on Iranian products, and it was kind of a way to isolate them. And cutting diplomatic ties means they were no longer making any kind of agreements with them. Now, if you look at the bottom, Iran ends its military treaties with the U.S. This is a picture of the students climbing the fence to the embassy in 1979. Another thing you need to know, whenever you have an embassy, okay, which is kind of like a building, and it represents a country. So if the United States has an embassy over in other countries, that is technically considered U.S. soil. So when you attack an embassy, you are technically declaring war on that other country. Okay? So just keep this in mind. We have Operation Eagle Claw. Oh. So, in April of 1980, Carter agrees to a rescue mission. Desert sandstorm caused a helicopter crash, and the mission was aborted. This is the wreck of the crashed helicopter in 1980. So he did try to create a rescue mission to get the American hostages, but because of a sandstorm in the desert, it's a very dry area where the Tehran embassy is, the mission was aborted. We're continuing with the hostage crisis. In July 27th, the Shah dies of cancer in Egypt. In November, new negotiations begin for the release of the hostages. And on January 20th, 1981, remaining hostages were released just hours after Reagan was sworn in as president of the United States. And these are the hostages reporting home in 1981. Now we have the 1980 presidential election. The Iran hostage crisis and economic problems hurt Carter's chances for re-election. Reagan, or Ronald Reagan, was a conservative Republican and former governor of California. He was actually also an actor. Reagan wins the election with 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. This is kind of embarrassing, okay? That's a lot of votes. He also had 44 million popular votes to Carter's 35 million. Reagan serves 2 terms in office, which is a total of 8 years. Oops. So, Ronald Reagan, he promises Americans a better future. He believes that the federal government had too much power and taxes were too high. So he actually believes in what is known as smaller government. So his goals during his presidency, he wants to cut taxes and increase military funding. He also promoted values and morality. So this is Reagan addressing Congress in 1981. So like I said, this is President Reagan addressing Congress in 1981. What you also need to know that this person behind is George H.W. Bush, who is Reagan's vice president, and he will also later become president after Reagan. So we have what is known as Reaganomics. Congress passes the largest tax cut since the New Deal, but only the wealthiest Americans benefited from the tax cut. Now, what again, another economics term, there is this theory known as trickle-down economics. So the idea behind trickle-down economics is if they cut taxes for the wealthy, that it'll eventually affect the poor. So for example, if I cut taxes on these large companies, then that means that they will have more money to invest into their employees. So what happened is, again, this idea is that the wealthy who benefited would spend and invest more, improve the economy, and then create new jobs. So if you look here, this is pre-trickle-down economics from 1947 to 1981. And then you have post-trickle-down economics, 1981 to 2015. And it shows the economic growth. Okay. So again, this is the 40th percentile, 60th percentile, and 95th percentile income group. So Reaganomics, this is something that Reagan was known for during his presidency. At first, it causes a recession in 1981 and 1982. But in 1983, the economy actually starts to stabilize and the economy grows. Stagnation of the 1970s ended, but the federal deficit grew and the poverty rate increased. So this is President Reagan signing the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Now, this is what Reagan is known for. Soviet relations. Reagan believed the U.S. military needed to be strong against the Soviet threat. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He also noticed or believed that communism seemed to be spreading across the globe. Now, one of the things that President Reagan believed in, which he was kind of made fun of a little bit, but now in 2020 it makes sense, he called Star Wars. It was a space-based missile defense system called the Strategic Defense Initiative. So Excalibur was a proposed X-ray laser-based anti-missile technology. This image on the right shows a single Excalibur exploding in the upper left of the image and firing at the 3 targets. In practice, each warhead would fire at dozens of thousands of targets at once. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but what you need to know is that during this point in time, the satellites have become a major thing, okay? We have satellite systems that are used to give you access to the internet. You also have satellites that can control your online banking. You have satellites that control just about everything at this point. So if something were to get knocked out as part of a attack on another country, because that could happen, people need to be prepared. But he kind of was, like I said, made fun of this at this point. But like I said, in 2020, this is a real possibility. We also have what is known as the Reagan Doctrine. This promised American support to freedom fighters who opposed communism around the globe. The CIA provided training to government of El Salvador. The U.S. Marines were sent to Grenada to end communist threat and instill a U.S.-friendly government. He also provided support to the Mujahideen rebels in Afghanistan fighting against the Soviets. So this is just an example of Reagan supporting anti-communist around the world. We also have anti-terrorism. In October of 1983, this is when we start to see suicide bombers. There was a suicide bomber in Lebanon who killed over 200 U.S. Marines. Reagan warned the world that if the U.S. could prove a link between the terrorist acts in a country, that the U.S. would take action, meaning war. And this shows how this person got in. So the Iran or Iran-Contra affair. In 1983, terrorist groups loyal to Iran took American hostages in Lebanon. Reagan urges U.S. allies not to sell weapons to Iran for its war against Iraq. He said America will never make concessions to terrorists, which means they will never give in to their demands or support them. In November of 1986, newspapers leaked that the U.S. military supplies had been sold to Iran in exchange for Iranian support of releasing the American hostages. Americans were shocked that Reagan actually approved the sale of the weapons. So he was kind of behind this. Oliver North used the funds from this deal to support Nicaraguan Contras who fought against the country's communist government. Congress forbade giving Contras aid. The Reagan administration did so anyway. This is what Reagan is known for. During his presidency, we have Mikhail Gorbachev. He is the new in power, the prime minister to Russia. He implements policies of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost is openness and willingness to allow Western ideas and goods into the Soviet Union. He also allowed open criticism of the Soviet government and took steps towards freedom of the press. These are the two sitting in 1985. Continuing on. All right. Perestroika, outline of restructuring Soviet society. There is less government control of the economy, the introduction of private enterprise, and steps towards a democratic government. Now, what you need to know under communism, there is no such thing as private enterprise. There's also full-on government control of the economy. They decide what's produced. They decide who's actually producing it. And these are all economics terms that we will talk about when you get into my economics class in your senior year. This picture is Mikhail Gorbachev, President Reagan, and Vice President George H.W. Bush in 1988. So in December of 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. What happens is during this treaty is they start to get rid of 2 classes of nuclear weapons, and they also allowed each country on-site inspection of military installations. So this was starting to end the Cold War. Remember, we said the Cold War, it was this nuclear threat, okay? Both of these major countries, the Soviet Union and the United States, had nuclear access and nuclear weapons. They didn't actually fight any battles on the ground, but it was where they threatened each other with nuclear warfare. So through this treaty, they're actually starting to lower their weapons, okay? This is not all. So in 1988, Gorbachev reduces the number of Soviet troops in East Germany and other satellite states. He also allows non-communist parties to organize, which was huge. He encourages satellite states under the Soviet Union to move towards democracy. And this is what you need to know. This is what Ronald Reagan was very famous for. Keep in mind, Germany at this point was still separated by the Berlin Wall. So Reagan challenges Gorbachev to take action. He calls him out directly on television, and it's televised. You can watch it on YouTube. He says, Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And that was huge for a sitting president to directly call somebody out like that, to directly call out another leader of, basically one of the major countries in the world and who had been our enemy for a long time. The Berlin Wall fell months after Reagan's second term ended. The Cold War ends officially in 1991. And we will stop here.